My brother got the cottage on Georgian Bay. I got a gravel pit in Sudbury. That was the whole of it. 2 lines in my father's will, read out by a notary in a small office on Elgin Street on a Tuesday afternoon in November. My brother, let's call him what he was, charming, quick with a laugh, the kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel warmer, sat across from me and said nothing. He didn't need to. The cottage had been in the family since 1971. 4 bedrooms, a dock, a wood stove that smelled like pine sap. Everyone knew what it was worth. Everyone knew what the grapple pit was worth, too. Or thought they did. My wife, Sandra, didn't say much on the drive back to Ottawa. She looked out the passenger window the whole way up the 417. When we pulled into the driveway, she said, "He gave you a hole in the ground, Walter." She said it quietly, the way you'd tell a child something you'd been putting off. Not mean, just tired, disappointed in a way that had no particular target. She went inside and started making dinner, and I sat in the car for a while with the engine off. That was October. By Christmas, things between us had gotten worse. She didn't say the word failure. I want to be fair about that. But she said other things. She said, maybe I should have fought harder when Dad was still well enough to listen. She said my brother always knew how to position himself, and I never did. She said she was tired of watching me accept whatever I was handed. I was 63 years old, and my wife was telling me I had spent my life being too quiet. Maybe she was right. I don't know. I'm still not sure. What I know is that I drove up to Sudbury in January with a thermos of coffee and a pair of boots I hadn't worn since I retired from Transport Canada, and I walked the property alone for the first time. It was cold, the kind of Sudbury cold that gets into your collar no matter how you've bundled up. The land was roughly 18 acres. Mostly a worked-out aggregate quarry that had been leased out by my father to a paving contractor for years. The lease had expired in 2019 and no one had renewed it. The equipment was gone. What was left was rock face, a frozen drainage ditch along the east edge, and a small operations shed that smelled like diesel and old rubber. I didn't know what I was looking at, honestly. I walked the perimeter with my hands in my pockets. There was a survey stake near the northwest corner, orange paint half faded, and I stopped there and looked out at the Canadian Shield spreading away in every direction, gray and bone white under the snow, and I thought, what am I supposed to do with this? I almost turned around and drove home. Instead, I sat in the operations shed on an overturned pail and drank my coffee and looked at the folder of papers I'd brought from the notary. The deed, the expired lease agreement, some municipal tax receipts going back 8 years. There was also a folded page that had been tucked behind the deed, a letter handwritten from my father. Not to me specifically, it was addressed to whoever ends up with the Sudbury land, which I suppose was his way of covering his bases. The letter was 3 paragraphs. In the first, he said the property had been assessed more than once and that he'd always been told it was played out. In the second, he said he had received correspondence in 2021 from the Ministry of Mines and had not fully understood it. In the third, he said he hoped whoever received the land would take the time he himself had not taken. He signed it simply, Dad. I read it twice. Then I refolded it and put it in my breast pocket. When I got back to Ottawa, I called a mining property solicitor whose name I found to the Law Society of Ontario referral line. Her office was on Somerset Street, 3rd floor, and she had a whiteboard behind her desk with terms I didn't recognize. I told her I had inherited 18 acres of worked-out quarry in Sudbury, and that there was a letter mentioning Ministry of Mines correspondence from 2021. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have a copy of that correspondence?" I didn't, but I requested it. It took 6 weeks. The Freedom of Information request went through, and I received a package by registered mail at the end of February. I sat at the kitchen table with it after Sandra had gone to bed. It was 41 pages. I am not a technical man. I spent 30 years administering logistics contracts for the federal government, but I can read, I can follow a document. And what I read, slowly, over the course of 3 evenings, was that my father's land had been flagged in a provincial geological survey as a potential site of interest for critical mineral extraction, specifically nickel sulfide deposits at depth below the old aggregate layer. The 2021 letter had been a preliminary inquiry asking whether the landowner wished to participate in an exploratory option agreement with a junior mining company out of Toronto. My father had never responded. I called the solicitor back. What followed was not fast. I want to be clear about that. It was not a movie. There was no single moment where everything flipped. There were months of back and forth, of phone calls I didn't fully understand, of documents I had her read twice to me while I took notes. There was a period where nothing seemed to be happening at all, and I drove back to Sudbury alone again in April, just to stand on the land and remind myself it was real. My brother phoned me in March. He had heard, through some channel I still don't know, that I had retained a solicitor in connection with the Sudbury property. He was friendly on the phone. He asked how I was, how Sandra was. He said he hoped there wasn't some complication with Dad's estate that might slow things down. I told him things were fine. He said he was thinking about doing some work on the cottage. I said that sounded nice. After I hung up, I went and sat in the kitchen. Outside, the maple in the backyard was still bare. Sandra came in and poured herself tea and leaned against the counter and looked at me. "That was your brother," I said. "I know," she said. She'd heard my side of it. "He's curious about the Sudbury land." She didn't say anything. "I'm not ready to talk about what I've found," I said. "Not yet." She set down her mug. "What have you found, Walter?" I told her. I laid it out as plainly as I could. The geological survey, the ministry correspondence, the option agreement framework the solicitor had been reviewing. Sandra sat down partway through. She didn't interrupt me. When I was finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How certain is this?" she said. "Not completely. The deposit has to be confirmed by drilling. That's the next step. An exploratory agreement that gives the mining company the right to drill test cores in exchange for option payments. Option payments. Annual payments while they assess the site. If they proceed to a full agreement, it's a royalty structure." I slid the solicitor's summary sheet across the table. "These are the preliminary figures." Sandra read the page. Her face didn't change much, but she read it twice. The option agreement was signed in June. The Junior Mining Company, a legitimate operation publicly traded on the TSX Venture Exchange, with 3 other active sites in Northern Ontario, agreed to an initial option payment of $80,000, renewable annually, with escalating rates tied to exploration progress. If drilling confirmed the deposit and they moved to a production lease, the royalty rate was structured at a percentage of net smelter returns for the life of the mine. The solicitor told me, carefully, not to get ahead of the geology. The deposit might not prove out. It might be too deep, too diffuse, too expensive to extract. "These things often don't come to anything," she said. "But you have a real option. That's more than most people walk away with." I nodded. I understood that. I had spent 3 decades in government managing expectations, but I also knew what that survey had said about the sulfide signature at depth, and I knew what nickel was selling for. My brother found out in July, 2 weeks after the signing. I don't know how he found out. These things get around in small ways. A filing here, a registry search there. He called on a Saturday morning while I was pulling weeds in the backyard. Sandra watched from the kitchen window while I talked to him. He was still friendly. but underneath it I could hear something working. He said he'd heard I'd entered into some kind of agreement on the Sudbury property. He said he wanted to understand what was happening. He said, and I remember this exactly, Dad always meant for that land to be a family thing, Walt, not just yours. I stopped pulling weeds. I straightened up. He left it to me, I said. I know that. A pause. I'm just saying, if there's value there we didn't know about, maybe we should talk about how to approach it together. I was 63 years old. I had been told by my wife, by implication, by the whole shape of my life as my brother saw it, that I was the one who didn't know how to position himself, that I accepted what I was handed, that I was quiet in ways that cost me. I'll think about it, I said. Good, he said. Good. Let's have dinner soon. I hung up and looked at the weeds in my hand. Sandra had come to the back door. He wants in, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. What are you going to do? I thought about my father's letter, whoever ends up with the Sudbury land. The care in that phrasing, the quiet acknowledgement that he knew which son he was giving it to, and why, and what he hoped that son would do with the time he hadn't taken himself. I'm going to talk to the solicitor on Monday, I said, and I'm going to ask her to make sure every line of this agreement is airtight. In August, my brother proposed that I sell him a 50% stake in the land. He had retained his own lawyer by then. The offer came in writing. $40,000 for half ownership, with the provision that any future development decisions would require mutual consent. His lawyer had written it up to look reasonable. It probably was reasonable from a certain angle. $40,000 was real money, but 50% of a potential royalty stream on a confirmed nickel deposit was not $40,000. Not anywhere close. I declined. He countered. He went up to $65,000. Then $80,000. By October, he was at $120,000 for a 30% stake. Each time I read the offer. Each time I called the solicitor. Each time she said the same thing. The geology is looking more promising, not less. If you don't need the liquidity, there's no reason to share the upside. I didn't need the liquidity. Sandra and I had our pensions. We had the house on Clary Avenue. We were not rich, but we were not desperate. My brother, I was starting to understand, had leveraged the cottage quite heavily over the years. A line of credit against it, some investment decisions that had not gone well. He needed the money. He needed my hole in the ground. The drilling confirmed a deposit in February of the following year. Not the full extent. That would take more cores, more time, but enough. The junior mining company exercised its first option extension and the payment increased accordingly. The solicitor called me on a Tuesday afternoon. The same day of the week the will had been read, and told me the numbers. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Sandra was at her book club. I sat there alone in the quiet of the house, and I thought about my father sitting in this same kind of quiet in his own kitchen, in his final years, looking at correspondence he didn't understand and setting it aside. He had given me the land knowing I would read carefully. I believe that. I can't prove it, but I believe it. When Sandra came home that evening, I had made dinner. A simple thing. Roast chicken, potatoes, the green beans she likes from the Westboro market when they're in season. She came in and hung up her coat and stopped when she saw the table set properly. "What's the occasion?" she said. "I just wanted to," I said. We sat down. I poured the wine. We talked about her book club, about the novel they'd been reading, about nothing important. Then she set down her fork and looked at me. "Something happened today," she said. "Yes. Good or bad?" "Good," I said. "Very good, I think." She was quiet for a moment. "I said some unkind things to you after the will was read. I've been thinking about that." "You were disappointed." "I was scared," she said. We're at an age where you start counting things. And I looked at what he left you, and I thought we were going to spend the last part of our lives struggling. She looked at her wine glass. I shouldn't have put that on you the way I did. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the maple was bare again. Another November. I knew you were scared, I said. I was too. What did the solicitor say? Sandra asked. I told her. All of it. The confirmed deposit, the option exercise, the royalty projections if the company moved to full production. I laid it out the way I'd learned to over the past year. Carefully, without overpromising, with the appropriate caveats about geology and timelines and what might still not come to anything. But also with the numbers. The actual numbers. Sandra listened to all of it. When I was done, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Your father knew." I think so. He always knew which of you would actually read it. My brother called the following week. He had heard about the drilling results. How, I still don't know entirely. He was not hostile. I'll give him that. He congratulated me. He said he was glad the land had turned out to be worth something. He said Dad would have been pleased. Then, after a pause, he said he'd been having a hard year financially and asked if we might revisit the conversation about a stake. I told him no, not coldly, not with any particular satisfaction. I told him no, the same way I'd learned to sign off on government contracts that didn't serve the public interest, clearly, completely, without elaboration. He asked why. "Because you called it a hole in the ground," I said. "And you weren't wrong. It was, but I drove up there in January and I sat in the cold and I read every page of every document. That's all I did, and now it's mine." He didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't know what the Sudbury land will ultimately be worth. The production lease isn't signed. The full extent of the deposit isn't mapped. There are years of work ahead before anyone knows what the final number looks like. My solicitor reminds me of this regularly, and I appreciate her for it. But every quarter, a payment arrives. We've been able to do some things we'd put off. A new roof on the Cleary Avenue house. A trip to Victoria to see Sandra's sister. Nothing extravagant. We're not extravagant people. What I have, mostly, is a feeling I didn't expect at 63. Not triumph. I was never built for that. Something quieter. The feeling of a man who drove 4.5 hours in January cold to sit on a pail in a diesel-smelling shed and read a document no one else thought was worth reading. My father left me a hole in the ground. He was counting on me to find out what was at the bottom. I think about that January drive a lot. 4.5 hours up the 17, thermos of coffee going cold in the cuff holder, nobody waiting for me at the other end. I didn't go up there because I was brave. I went because I didn't know what else to do with what my father had left me, and sitting at home felt worse. That's the honest version of it. There was no grand decision. There was just a man in his 60s who had been told, not unkindly, but clearly, that he had ended up on the wrong side of things, and who drove north anyway, because the alternative was to agree. What I've come to understand, looking back, is that my father made a choice that had nothing to do with money. He knew which of his sons would sit on a pail in a diesel-smelling shed in the middle of winter and read 41 pages of ministry correspondence. He knew because he knew us both. He chose accordingly. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't favoritism. It was a kind of trust, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. And I nearly let it go to waste. Sandra said something to me that November evening that I've turned over many times since. She said she'd been scared, not disappointed in me, scared for us, for the years ahead, for all the things we'd put off and might not get to. I understand that fear now better than I did then. At our age, you do start counting. The margin for error shrinks. And when the count comes up short, it's easy to look sideways at the person next to you and wonder what went wrong. But fear, when you let it speak for you, says things that aren't quite true. It told Sandra I was a man who accepted whatever he was handed. It told me in quieter moments the same thing. Neither of us was right. What I've learned, and I mean learned the slow way, not the kind you read in a book, is that integrity isn't a dramatic thing. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It looks like a man who reads the document when everyone else has walked away from the table. It looks like patience in a cold shed. It looks like declining an offer not out of greed, but out of a clear sense of what's yours and what you're responsible for. And the wisdom in that, the actual, useful kind, isn't cleverness. It's not knowing more than the next person. It's being willing to sit with something confusing long enough that it starts to make sense. My brother is a smart man. He always was. But he looked at 18 acres of worked-out quarry and saw what it looked like on the surface. I looked at the same land and thought, I should probably read everything before I decide what this is. That's a small difference. It turned out to matter. The stubbornness required. I'll call it that because that's what Sandra would call it. To keep driving north in January, to retain a solicitor, to read 41 pages, to say no 3 times to a brother who kept raising his offer. That isn't heroism. It's just not quitting. It's deciding that the thing your father trusted you with is worth the trouble of understanding properly. I'm not a wealthy man. I'm not sure I'll ever think of myself that way, no matter what the Sudbury land eventually yields. But I am a man who showed up when it counted, read what needed to be read, and held the line when it would have been easier not to. My father knew I would. I almost proved him wrong. I'm glad I didn't.